This is the Power 98.7 podcast. Now we're talking. Subscribe to Power 98.7 podcasts in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. There's more on power987.co.za. Power Breakfast with Tessa Dooms. Weekdays 6 to 9 a.m.
It's 8:11 on Power Breakfast this morning, and as promised, we want to talk to the EFF about their view on this budget impasse. And there are a number of different angles to pursue here with the EFF that I'd like to get to, but maybe starting here with Dr. Gumani Chimomola. EFF's Senior Researcher and National Coordinator of Governance, just to take us firstly through what the EFF's proposals were in the Finance Committee that looked at that fiscal framework before it went into Parliament. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Chimomola. Give us the EFF's perspective on what the proposals should be.
Well, good morning, Tessa and the team and Power FM listeners, and thank you very much for having us. So we went to the Joint Standing Committee of Finance and the Select Committee on the 2nd of April, and we made the following proposal. Number one, we said that, firstly, let's amend the fiscal framework so that there's a complete rejection of VAT. That's the first thing. And then the second proposal we made was that we need to look at inflationary adjustments of personal income tax. Because if you remember, in the previous budget, there was no adjustment to inflation, and then we're doing it now for the second year. And the impact of that is if you were at a certain income bracket and then your employer adjusts your salary in terms of inflation, let's say 4.3, you then run a risk of now getting into a higher tax bracket, whereas your salary or your wage has not technically increased, but essentially it's just an adjustment in line with inflation, because last year's money is not the same money that you have today. And then we went to the other proposal. We said, look, South Africa has an issue of conceptualizing what is a wealth tax. Because we don't agree what is a wealth tax. And SARS will tell you that we have some form of wealth tax. But we're saying that let's look at, firstly, underutilized land holdings, which has essentially become luxury land holdings if you go to certain parts of the country. So just by merely owning a stand in certain areas, it becomes a luxury portfolio.
Sure.
Let's look at that and then let's think around that and tax it. Let's look at an apartheid tax, something that was never done before, regardless of many proposals and recommendations. And then let's look at an annual inherited wealth.
What would an apartheid tax be? What would an apartheid tax be?
So there is some scientific evidence to suggest that towards the late 80s, early 1990s, majority of the trusts that were created around that time, and obviously old trusts, were used to transfer a lot of wealth that was in individual names to these entities that are very fictitious and not easy to understand, and they're hidden in some nature. To say that accumulation of wealth during Let's categorize it, simply put, to say since the formation of the union up until then, everyone who created wealth at that time was supported by an apartheid state, which was exploiting and extracting wealth from black people, and they never benefited from that economy. And if we can conceptualize and define it, then we can agree to some level of you are supposed to pay an apartheid tax because you benefited from the exploitation and the dehumanization and dispossession of black people. That's conceptually the idea with an apartheid tax. And this is not new, by the way. And then we went on to make proposals around what should be an expenditure package of this budget, because our main concern with what we're dealing with now, everyone is making proposals around reducing the size of the state. So they will tell you about spending reviews, you cut this,
austerity.
You don't have to do this, austerity. And essentially what we proposed is that let's have a package, a stimulus package, because essentially we're dealing with a crisis. I don't think this is a less of a crisis than what we had during COVID, which then warrants a stimulus package where we shouldn't be too much concerned with what is considered a necessity of a budget surplus so that we deal with debt management. We then have to move towards the debt is fine as long as you then allocate the money towards productive areas of the economy.
Sure.
Because the state must be at the center of what then reorganize and stimulate economic growth. So those were the key proposals. And we talk about an amount there of around 500 billion with some basic modeling in our proposals.
Just a quick question about your modeling. Does it show that this money could be raised in the same amount of time that, for instance, VAT would bring in? I'm just trying to see here in terms of whether it's a like-for-like, in-the-moment kind of alternative.
Well, look, the VAT issue for us, it's important, but in a different way. And let me put it this way. So the VAT is looking at around 18.5 billion if we raise it by 0.5 percentage point. But you are still confined within an economic framework wherein you are happy with, first of all, the 1.8 growth projection in the next 3 years. You are still confined within the idea that you still need to balance this budget within the current framework. But this current budget does not expand the state. That's the key issue here. So it can't be like for like when you look at the revenue proposals that are being put on the table. They are far much bigger, but also the sources of money that we're looking at in terms of the expenditure side. It goes beyond the 13 billion. I mean, we're looking at half a trillion towards around 500 billion or so.
Gotcha.
As an economic stimulus, it's through the fiscal and monetary policy. And all of it must not necessarily reflect on the budget that was tabled by the Minister of Finance. It is this problematic distinction of fiscal and monetary policy that we have, to think that the minister can't put a proposition in his budget to say, part of what we need on the side of the monetary policy is the following things to support the fiscal policy in order to grow the economy. So that's what we're challenging conceptually, but we're trying to put numbers in the discussion because we're confined to the fiscal framework budgetary discussion in Parliament.
And I did want to raise these because later in the segment we are going to be talking to a development economist around the impact of where we get the money from and what we use it for. But I just wanted to zero in on also the EFF deciding to take this decision of Parliament to court, because BOSA, for example, is also saying they've got a number of proposals on the table. Action SA say they have a number of proposals on the table, and all of them are saying that they can get these proposals in before May 1. You're saying that your proposals can't be just shoved in before May 1, that you actually want to overturn the decision to have this budget approved. Tell us on the basis on which you think this decision could be overturned by the courts and what you think the timeline looks like.
Okay, now, so there are two simple things with this equation of the committee meetings themselves and the adoption of the fiscal framework, right?
Yeah.
The first one is that there's a simple process. So we went into that meeting on the 2nd of April. The first thing that, if you have watched the recording, Snawo asked the chairperson of the committee, would it not make sense that based on the Money Bills Amendment Procedure, Section 8.4, we agree as the committee as to whether we are accepting the fiscal framework as tabled by the minister or we are going to amend it. And once we take a decision, it will then inform how we structure the report, which will then ultimately be tabled in the National Assembly and the National Council of Provinces for adoption. That was the question. Now, that was not done. And I could understand the reluctance from the chair because, firstly, I think this is the first time in the history of fiscal policy post-1994 that we talk so much about the budget.
Absolutely.
It has not been done like this. But in that question, it does not get responded to. Firstly, it gets dismissed. Now, there's a temptation here to want to do things the way you've always done them, even though they were not according to the law, but just simply because you had majority. In the middle of that conversation, there's then the VAT issue that arises, and the Action SA member then raised an amendment. Firstly, it was an amendment, not what was finally captured in the report. It was a clear amendment, and I have the original text.
And so, just to pause there, the committee has two options: to either amend what is before them or pass what is before them. And you're saying that what happened was what was passed was before them, and now we're trying to amend after.
Look, the question was not answered in the first place, but when Action SA brought their proposal, it was a clear amendment because it had the word, we are amending. The ANC agreed to it. So now comes back again and says, are we now amending the fiscal framework? Then there was a confusion. The meeting stopped for an hour. And then when the ANC came back to that meeting, they steamrolled the process. There was never a question put before the committee to say, we have agreed to accept the fiscal framework as tabled by the minister, and therefore this becomes the position of the committee.
Interesting.
That was not done. So we are not saying that if the majority agree on VAT, it should not happen. If majority of the political parties agree on VAT in the committee and we don't have the numbers, that's okay. But at least put the question as per the Act, because it's clear. That must be a clear statement, and this has not been done. So that's why we're taking the matter to court, and that's why we wrote to the Speaker. And when we wrote to the Speaker, we were not arguing against whether VAT should be there or not. That was not the discussion. The discussion was, take the report back to the committee and ask them to put the question, because our understanding is that Action SA did not understand money bills amendment procedure, because we had to explain to them during the break to say, what you're doing is an amendment, but it's not being accepted by your colleagues in the ANC. So they went obviously caucus and came back with a recommendation. So whatever Busa, Action SA and Rise Mzansi are saying, none of you guys have asked them, firstly, which legislation are you using to then make this recommendation and intervention in the next 30 days? That becomes a critical question, because we're using the money bills, which is a procedure as per the law.
In fairness, I did ask Herman Mashaba this question earlier this week, and his answer was a political answer, which said that, well, he knows that there isn't anything by law that can be done, but that the ANC here can step in because the ANC has given them their word. And so this is a gentleman's agreement type of thing where the ANC is giving their word that they will make it happen. And if they don't, they will then, as Action SA, not pass the subsequent budgets that come from the appropriations. So they're saying that they will have political consequence because they don't have an answer to how this is going to be done. It's the ANC's job to get it done. What's your view on that?
That's fine, but you can't go to the Western Cape High Court and say that there was a political agreement or a gentleman's agreement in the corridors. What we're dealing with here, and this must be clear, the way you process the fiscal framework, the division of revenue bill, appropriation bill, and all other money bills flows from the Constitution, Section 77. It goes to the money bills, and this is why that committee is critical. You have to give a clear statement of accepting or rejecting. It can't be how Mashaba and everyone else feels and agree in the corridors, and then they come and impose that over and above what the law allows in the committee. And that becomes a challenging thing. So if Herman can't answer which law is using, then we should tell him that what you're proposing is irrational, illogical, and it will not happen in the next 30 days. Now, not even 30 days anymore.
It really won't even be 30 days by the time you guys reconvene.
There has to be a VAT increase of 0.5%. There's no doubt about it. What he's talking about of political consequences and everything else is wishy-washy. And here is what is important, Tessa. The money bill goes further. There's this idea that the fiscal framework is not binding. And I know some of my colleagues in law are saying that where it says considered means that there could be movements within the fiscal framework. And I agree to that. But the bottom line is that whatever proposal you make in the appropriation bill, division of revenue bill, and all other money bills, including revenue bills, have to be consistent with what we have adopted in the fiscal framework. It's not in part one stage where it says, no, we've adopted a framework, therefore we go and do other things with other bills. They have to be consistent with each other until you finish the process in line with an act, which is an act of parliament.
So I genuinely appreciate this conversation because I do think it helps us think through the implications and what is actually possible and what is going to be at stake from the 21st of April when Parliament reconvenes. So thank you so much. That is Dr. Gumani Chismomola, the EFF Senior Researcher and National Coordinator of Governance. And after the news, we're going to speak to Chifipa Mangho, the DCG economist, to break down the implications of this VAT increase if it does go through.
You've been listening to a Power 98.7 podcast. For more podcasts, visit power987.co.za or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.